Good afternoon, and welcome to the Music and Technology Seminar at Carnegie Mellon. Our guest today is Patrick Durham. When the recording studio at Carnegie Mellon was under construction, two students, Patrick Durham and Michael Buselink, were recruited to assist in the design. When they graduated from CMU, they were hired as full-time employees of the company that designed the studio, the very room we are in now, the Vlahakis Recording Studio. Michael eventually left Pittsburgh to go to law school. Patrick left to continue his career as a consulting engineer for spaces and venues, large and small. Please welcome Patrick Durham to today's seminar.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. I appreciate that intro, and it's nice to be a guest to speak to all of you today. And I always enjoy seeing or virtually participating in the recordings, the Vlahakis recording studio, since I've got many fond memories within that room. The topic for today's seminar is spatial audio reinforcement in worship spaces in particular. So I chose a recent project that was completed as a case study because I think it's got some great takeaways and practical applications of spatial sound reinforcement. I was going to quickly introduce myself. Beyond what Ricardo already said, I'm a consulting engineer, graduated from CMU. My major was in electrical and computer engineering, but I feel like I spent almost as much time over in the College of Fine Arts and the School of Music doing my minor in music technology because I was very passionate about it. And then, as Ricardo mentioned, I'm a consulting engineer, and I'm very fortunate to, on a day-to-day basis, get to apply art and physical science principles to create real-world practical solutions in the built environment. Things that I love are music and engineering, and I like to design things. I also really love tackling challenges, which is kind of why I'm an engineer, I guess. And I love Pennsylvania, I like Colorado. I also like to travel, Italy, Japan, and I love dogs. So this is my dog Greta. This is Tartan Plaid Greta. This is Rocky Mountain Greta. And this is Aloha Greta. She has never been to anywhere outside of Colorado or New Mexico, but that's okay. She gets to pretend. So bringing it back to the topic for today's seminar, the overview is we were brought in to assist in the remodel of a Denver area historic Catholic church, Risen Christ Catholic parish. This church was actually the very first one constructed by the Archdiocese of Denver in the late 1960s. They hired a renowned architect, James Settler. That architect, he drew inspiration from many world-class architects, one of which was the Swiss-French architect Le Corbusier. I forget his actual name, forgot to write it down, but one particular work by Le Corbusier is in France, the Chapelle Notre-Dame du Haut. Got a photo of it here. And then I'm going to show a photo of the Risen Christ Catholic Church here in Denver. And maybe you'll see a few similarities with the architecture. There's actually a round silo as well, but it's out of the photo. But here in Denver, when you think of Colorado, a lot of people think about what? Skiing, mountains. And so the locals here call it the ski jump church, which is kind of funny. The project goals for this renovation, as they related to audio, and that was one of there were some others related to space configuration and handicap accessibility and things like that, but the audio goals were really front and center, and they were to improve the natural room acoustics, also to replace the amplified sound reinforcement system because it wasn't doing a very good job. we'll get into that a little more here. They had another goal, which was to relocate the choir from inside of the nave to the rear corner of the nave, basically behind the seating. And the reason for that was they felt disconnected from the rest of the congregation. I'll show you some images here in a minute that illustrate that. But in so doing, and in distancing the choir away from the clergy, another goal established was to make sure that we had accurate localization for the chancel, which is the front of the worship area near the sacristy where the priest and all of them are, versus the choir which would now be at the back of the nave. And then, of course, a very key goal was to provide better intelligibility for not only spoken word, but also choral and instrumental music. Again, this is a historic register building, and they were not going to take this renovation lightly. So it was critical that they achieve good intelligibility. The budget for the sound system renovation was around $250,000, around $230,000. So just to orient you in plan view with this building, this is a sort of a bird's eye look at the building. You'll notice it's essentially triangular, but concave, I guess, on all sides. The the sacristy and the chancel here, which is where the worship or rituals take place, is up at the north corner, north end of the room. The choir used to be up in a loft, even farther behind where the priests were. And then the congregation sat out here in the rest of the triangle. So in the rest of the plan views, to make things easy, we sort of rotated so that, the chancel is actually up at the top, and then the rest of the audience is down below. This actually it's a plan view showing the locations of the original loudspeakers that were all just ceiling mounted. Pretty standard approach for a system designed about 25 years ago. Basically just point source loudspeakers from the ceiling, and then a layer of delay loudspeakers farther back. And then, as I mentioned, they wanted to move that choir from the northernmost part of the worship hall all the way down to the lower left, or to the back corner. So I'll show a few photos of the space. This photo is taken from sort of the entry or back part of the nave. These are all before photos. So this is what it used to look like when we first got involved. There's some beautiful stained glass at the front. You'll notice that original main loudspeaker cluster was right dead center, which actually has an unfortunate consequence of partially concealing the view to the stained glass windows. So they also told us that they would strongly prefer that the new loudspeakers did not obscure the stained glass. So that was another challenge that we were posed with. And you can, if you look real carefully, you can sort of see where the choir area is sort of up and above and behind the chancel here. There is a pulpit, or in the Catholic speak, it's an ambo over here on the audience's right side. I'll show a few other views. This one's taken even farther back in the audience area, or the congregation area. This is actually roughly where the choir was going to end up being relocated to. So in this photo, you can see the original sound system. Another thing I wanted to point out is the complex geometry of the space. And so you'll remember when I showed the plan view, it's convex on the walls, but it has a convex curvature of the ceiling too, mixed with a concave, I guess, curvature heading from south to north. And then here's a view from the altar area originally, looking back at the congregation. Again, you can get a pretty good view of that curvature of the ceiling. this comes into play in a few slides when I begin to talk about the natural room acoustics. So that's why I'm pointing that out. And then here's the view from the where the choir loft used to be, which includes obviously space for the choralists, but also they have an organ. It's an electronic organ, but it sounds pretty nice, and some room for instrument positions too. Okay, so the first problem that we approached was the room acoustics itself, the natural room. Now, there's in room acoustics, or I should say in acoustics, we look at various things, not just the performance of the room, but we also look at performance of the mechanical systems to ensure that we have low noise. We also look at sound isolation to ensure that unwanted sounds from, for example, the street nearby don't make their way through the doors and the walls. But the focus of this one is really on the inside the room, the reverberation. What we did is we sent our team out. We have some measurement equipment. We measured the reverb time, or the T60, which is the time it takes for the sound to drop 60 decibels. Once you play pink noise through some loudspeakers and then you cut it off, you measure that decay time. If sound energy reflections arrive essentially more than 30 milliseconds after the initial arrival, then it's detrimental on speech intelligibility. So that's something to keep in mind. And it is natural in a worship area where you're going to be blending speech, but also music. So there's sort of conflicting goals there. For speech intelligibility, you want a low reverberate T60 time. But for music, you want a rather high T60 time, because it sounds unnatural if the decay happens too quickly, especially in a house of worship. So what we ended up recommending for the mid-frequency band, 500 to 1,000 hertz, which is where most intelligibility occurs, was a little bit over 1 second, so about 1.3 to 1.5 seconds. That's the target. Based on our measurements on site, we set up 8 different positions. Oh, I kind of glossed over that in the last view, but when you go out and you take measurements, you do the measurements from multiple locations in the room. So it takes a little bit of time to move your microphone and restart your signal generator and all that. The results of those measurements were way in excess of 2 seconds. Really, as you get down into the low frequency band, it was even over 3 seconds, which was not good at all. But the average of all of those locations was right around 2.5 seconds. So it's greatly exceeding our target of 1.3 to 1.5 seconds. So we definitely had our work cut out for us. We worked with the architect. I should say I work for a company, and all we do is acoustical engineering and also audio video engineering. So we have folks who are really highly versed and qualified on acoustics, and then I'm not one of those. And then we also have folks who are very experienced in AV, audio video systems, as well as theatrical systems too. That's another arena that we play in. So our acoustics engineer worked with the architect, and the solution that they ended up arriving at was to cover the ceiling. They were going to replace the ceiling. And so it was a great opportunity to cover the ceiling with 3-inch thick broadband stretched fabric ceiling panels. And so when you think of absorptive ceiling panels, usually they're pretty visible. You can kind of tell what they are. In this case, they wanted it to disappear into that nice curved ceiling as much as possible. We predicted a reverb time of around 1.5 seconds, or 1.3 to 1.5, as I said. We helped provide some details for the architect and eventually the contractor who was going to build everything on how to install the insulation and then how to cover it with fabric. It's highly skilled work. And then, of course, there are light fixtures and speakers that are going to be in the ceiling too. So you have to plan on how to work around those. And here's a photo of the end result. applying about 2,500 square feet of acoustic treatment on the ceiling. You may notice that they took advantage of this ceiling renovation to create a bit of a soffit, and then it blended nicely into that 3-inch thick insulation with the fabric. So the fabric, if you're not really looking up at it, it pretty much disappears. It looks pretty contiguous with the plaster ceiling as well. And then it transitions back to plaster as you go back to the back of the room. So that worked out well. I did not mention, but we did go out and measure, and we in fact did achieve a rough range of 1.4 to 1.5 seconds. The T60 does vary depending on how many people are in the room. Of course, every human body that you bring into a room adds more absorption. So we included that in our calculations. So the next category of problem that we approached was dealing with the audio reinforcement. So there's natural sound reinforcement, and then there's amplified sound reinforcement. So the first thing I was going to do is present just the natural, how the sound waves were performing in this room naturally. It sort of serves a backdrop to what we're going to be dealing with in the electronic way. So I've showed plenty of photos. The room is architecturally just breathtaking and it's beautiful. However, it's not conducive to good natural sound propagation within a room. This is a cross-section view of a typical concert hall. And most of you are probably familiar with the general geometry of a good concert or performance venue, where you have a sort of a tighter shell or back drop where the musicians perform, or in this case, people are speaking. And then you use an increasingly pitched ceiling, and sometimes the architect or acoustical engineer will design sound reinforcement or reflective panels to help direct those sound first order reflections to where they want them to go. So the direct sound path obviously goes straight from the mouth or the instrument directly to the listener's ears, but then the first order reflection is what's really key, and you want them to be broadly distributed among the entire audience. This is just natural, so we're not talking about any loudspeakers at all here. This is what would be the optimal geometry. The geometry of our church, unfortunately, is like this. So this is a cross-section view of that of the nave. We go from the back of the room on the left-hand side up to the ski jump up on the right-hand side. And so you can see in the red, I've penciled in the choir singers and what happens with those first order reflections from their voices. They basically either hit the ceiling and then they go backwards behind them, or they hit the ceiling and then they come straight back down to them, or they hit the ceiling and then they go back down to the clergy or the priest in the chancel, which is not especially helpful. For the priest, their sound goes up to the ceiling and unfortunately just doesn't make it out very far into the audience area before it substantially decays. So when we encountered the space, there was a conventional sound reinforcement system consisting of just point source main loudspeaker, or it was a cluster of 2 loudspeakers, an array. So that is roughly drawn in here, and I've sort of sketched in the coverage area using a green hatching area there. So there's a ceiling mounted speaker and hatched area. Now there's an issue with this this approach. A point source loudspeaker system will decay, the sound will decay by 6 decibels with every doubling of distance from the speaker. So the closest audience member is, right around 22 to 23 feet away. And then midway down the audience, you're almost double that. So now you're at 6 dB as you go halfway back into the audience. And then as you go toward the rear of the audience, you're it's almost double the distance yet again. And so now we're down to negative 12 dB. This is a serious problem. And so it wasn't a surprise when we first, so I have a slide on the inverse square law for those who aren't familiar with this. The formula there on the bottom, 20 log 10 of the ratio of the distances. So to overcome that problem, the original sound system engineer had put in a series of delay speakers halfway back in the room. Problem solved. It only solved the problem from a loudness perspective. It actually introduced another issue by doing that, which resulted in lower intelligibility. And the reason for that is there's another problem here dealing with the time of arrival, because in this audio system, there was no signal delay between the front main loudspeaker cluster and the set of delay speakers. So you have the audio, the main source, that signal is arriving at the listener's ears at the back several milliseconds after the sound is arriving from the delay speakers. And so if you have a time of arrival that exceeds, well, it becomes noticeable really around 5 milliseconds. It becomes problematic if it's greater than 8 or 10 milliseconds. This distance here is approaching 100 feet from the main to the rear. And so that distance was definitely in excess, or it resulted in excess of a 5 millisecond delay, probably more like 7 or 8 milliseconds. And so especially if you think about the triangular shape of the nave, we're only looking at a cross section that goes straight down the middle. It actually gets even worse if you consider the listeners who are farther out into the kind of the wings, if you will, the very, very back of the audience. And so it was a more exaggerated difference. So the time of arrival was a problem. And this was going to become a really serious problem when the parish told us that they wanted to move the choir away from the loft and over into the back of the congregation area. Now we have a major problem because we want to reinforce the choir, which is going to be in a corner of the room, and then we want to reinforce the priest. But you can't simply do something similar to what was already there with no signal delay. It would result in pretty bad or pretty significant times of arrival differences, not only or now for both different sources. So the approach that we employed for the loudspeaker design, or the sound reinforcement design, I guess we should call it, was a distributed point source system. And there's two different types of speakers used. We had some ceiling mounted loudspeakers. So those are illustrated in the lower left-hand corner of the slide. And then we also used some small format line array or column array loudspeakers mounted on the walls. So that would be these pictures on the lower right-hand side. As far as signal processing, the approach was, in order to address the time of arrival issues, we were going to need to come up with a delay matrix so that we adjusted, or we intentionally delayed the signal for each of those, for each successive layer of delay speakers. But because we had two different audio object sources, if you will, there's the source of audio generated at the front of the room or the chancel. And then there's a whole different set of audio sources generated from the choir and the music area. And so we needed to have two delay matrices. And we decided to utilize object-based mixing and basically establish level and delay settings for each of the loudspeakers mapped to each possible source location. And so it becomes this very large matrix. And depending on which input you're sending into the system, whether it's a choir mic or it's a clergy mic or it's a different microphone, maybe at the baptismal area, I didn't even mention that one, it has a whole different set of level and delay settings within the system. So here's a plan view layout of these are just the ceiling speakers in this the new configuration. So right off the bat, I'll bring in this is just the first layer. This is the chancel audio source. So the chancel is up here in the at the north end right here. So similar to before, we had a couple of main loudspeakers, and you'll see that we separated them so that we weren't going to obscure the stained glass. Then we had another series of loudspeakers ceiling mounted for the initial delay, and then there's yet another set of delay loudspeakers to cover those small wing areas at the back. Okay. What about wall-mounted speakers? So we're still talking about the chancel generated audio. We actually additionally used those small format column speakers on the left and the right walls. Some of you may be wondering why we would have done that. If I go back a slide, so this main set of loudspeakers, their area of coverage really only begins around 20 or 20, 30 feet farther into the house. And so we needed some better coverage of the parishioners who were sitting much closer to the sanctuary. And so that's what these two left and right column speakers would accomplish. Very tight pattern control. And of course, using EQ, we can limit the amount of low frequency unwanted noise that would possibly get injected back into the sanctuary. And then we had another layer of wall-mounted delay speakers farther into the nave. So that covers layer one, that's the chancel audio. And so now we need to talk about layer two. That would be any audio generated from the choir area, which again is down in the lower left-hand corner. For that, we have a series of 7 wall-mounted small format column array speakers arranged thus. And you can sort of visualize here that they're arranged to provide successive reinforcement with delay as the sound originates in the corner and then as it moves its way out into the nave. We had the benefit of, there's a couple of architectural columns in the middle of the space. You can sort of see them here on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side. So we had the benefit of being able to add a column speaker right there. It would have been nice if we could somehow magically put another speaker or two kind of in this general vicinity of the nave. However, that was right smack in the middle of the seating area, and so there was just no practical way to do that. So you do the best you can. This is a cross-sectional view. It's the same section that I had drawn before, kind of showing the bad natural acoustics, but it just illustrates those various loudspeaker placements. And so you can see the main speaker array, one of the main speaker cabinets on the ceiling. You can see the successive delay ceiling mounted speakers farther back. On the walls, you can see the first larger column array that covers the parishioner seating who are seated close to the chancel. And then we have some additional column arrays as you move farther back. I know it's a lot to look at, so don't worry too much. And we do have a person standing in the choir area just to illustrate that. Since I'm on this slide, I'll go ahead and point out that we did cover the choir with a couple of suspended choir mics. They actually suspend quite a bit farther down, around 5.5 feet down. So, but I'll mention those choir mics a little bit later. And then this is just another, it's actually more of an elevation view here, looking straight back at the back of the nave. So what you can see here are those multiple small column speakers that were used to reinforce the choir. The choir is over here on the right-hand side now, since we're looking backwards. And you can see each of these, they're called S4 loudspeakers on our drawings. So these two S4s right here would be the initial ones, and then a small delay to the next couple of speakers, and then a longer delay, or excuse me, it's reversed. So we'll get into how we approached this system and how it works, and people can localize where it comes from the choir. All right, so now I want to talk about the spatial reinforcement. So there's a processing engine. Most loudspeaker systems nowadays have a digital signal processing engine built into them. I've mentioned that we used object-based mixing. So the sound objects that are placed up in the chancel are amplified through the mains and the delays, and then the sound objects placed in the choir area are used through those choir speakers, the ones that I highlighted blue. The result was kind of a seamless blending of both systems, and we provided good coverage throughout the whole room. The key to make this work was for people to properly localize where the sound was coming from. We didn't want people to hear choir music and for their ears to tell them that it was coming from the front of the room, because then that would be incongruent with what they were seeing with their eyes, which is a choir kind of over their left shoulders. And then conversely, of course, you wouldn't want the priests and clergy's audio to be sounding like it's coming from the choir area. And so what was used in principle is the precedence effect. It's based on the Haas. It's essentially the Haas effect. So the way this effect works is essentially, if you hear two versions of a sound, the same sound coming from two different locations, if they are under 2 milliseconds apart, then you perceive a single event, and you perceive it as coming from the average of those two locations. And so if you, let's say in your home theater, you have a left speaker and a right speaker, and the same sound is played at the exact same time from both speakers, because and assuming that you're seated dead center in your listening area, then the time of arrival should be identical or nearly identical, less than 2 milliseconds apart. Therefore, your localization of that sound should be right dead center, even though the sound objects were originating from possibly 45 degrees left and 45 degrees right. However, if the time of arrival exceeds 2 milliseconds, then you begin to perceive a spatial location, not based on the average location or distance of those objects, but actually more based on the first wavefront of the sound object. So if it's greater than 2 milliseconds, the first object that hits you, even though the second object can be the same loudness level, you will actually localize the sound to come from the first one, which would be, let's say it's the left speaker. So if the left speaker arrives more than 2 milliseconds before the right, you're going to localize it to the left. And so we utilize this precedence effect in the layout of the system, so that all of the parishioners seated in the pews would properly locate a choir generated or music generated source over in that direction. You can manually calculate the delays based on an object or a source audio location to each of the speakers. It's not impossible, it's just extremely tedious. And so a lot of loudspeaker manufacturers now have software that will perform this object-based calculation for you. It's done graphically, and it's pretty slick. So this is just a snapshot of the software from the manufacturer that we chose, D&B Audio-Technica. Their environment for doing object-based audio is called Soundscape, and this is a snapshot from one of their applications called InScene. So you can see the software has been set up with the loudspeakers in their respective locations. Each of the loudspeakers has parametric data entered for its relative distance, height, etc., and orientation. And it knows the performance characteristics of each loudspeaker, and then you can literally drag the objects around wherever you want them to be within the soundstage. If you drag an object outside of the soundstage, which would be this kind of orange rectangle, then it will no longer reinforce it because there's no way to create negative delay. But as long as it's within the soundstage for the system, then it will automatically calculate the necessary delay and the associated level adjustment, the gain adjustment, for that audio source. So this one in the lower left-hand corner would more or less represent where the choir and instrumentalist would be located. It'll automatically create an adjustment for the level and the delay setting for that object to each of the loudspeakers that are going to be used to represent it. Again, some more snapshots from the software from that manufacturer, DNB. So this set of screenshots show the sound object up at the front of the. It's actually rotated, so the chancel is over on the left-hand side in these screenshots here. But the sound object that they first are concerned with is anyone who's speaking up at the front of the room. So you can see the top chart shows just the simple loudness or SPL graph. Everything looks pretty uniform there. And then the lower chart indicates localization. So it's actually very good localization achieved for this area. The main listening area, of course, is this chart right here. The one that's in dark red is not crucial because that's where the priests are standing. So we weren't really reinforcing over there. And then the next, this slide shows the same two charts, but this would be for sound objects over in the choir area. I made a comment earlier that it would have been nice if we could have put a few more loudspeakers farther into the nave to help reinforce that choir. So you do see a little bit of decay in terms of loudness. And then similarly on the localization, it gets, it's fairly uniform as you farther out. There's a little bit of non-uniformity sort of right in the center here. One of the reasons is there's a column that's actually causing a shadow. But it actually ended up being pretty good. And then I'll just kind of quickly skim through a few of the last little bits here. So on the signal processing and routing, they wanted a way to manually mix everything. And so their choir director, we worked with them. We chose an Allen and Heath console, the SQ5, which allows you to store various scene or group settings, depending on what they're going to do, whether it's a daily mass, maybe a Sunday mass, which has a much bigger contingent of deacons and priests and a much fuller choir. So we have different settings for those two different scenarios. They also have baptism events, things like that. Hidden away into a closet where an equipment rack was, were some other components like the acoustics DSP core to help process all of the various inputs and also outputs. We had a few other zones like a cry room and some narthexes where we reinforced audio for people arriving late, for example. And then as part of the loudspeaker system, there was a dedicated set of processing and amplification. So those are, this one right here is running the object-based calculations, the large one on the right, lower right, and then a series of smaller power amplifiers, which also have onboard processing too. Just a quick close-up look in the choir area. So they have their organ, they have their keyboard. We set them up with a personal monitoring mix system, also by Allen and Heath. Allen and Heath, as a lot of manufacturers now, they offer Dante audio over IP, so we utilize that. Gave them plenty of flexibility. What about microphones? I know some of you might be gearheads and curious about what microphones we used. So I briefly mentioned the pulpit or the ambo up at the front of the room earlier. How many of you guys have been into a worship service where, or frankly, any environment where people walk up to the podium or the lectern and then they're constantly fidgeting with the gooseneck mic that's there? And I would say at least 50% of the time, they don't quite get it aimed right at their mouth. And so it's not properly amplifying them. We knew that was definitely going to be the case in a scenario where people would come up to read scriptures or give a testimonial or something like that, and they may not be trained and used to using the system. Also, they wanted to make the new ambo made out of marble, and so we really wanted to prevent having an unsightly gooseneck microphone on that. So what we chose to do, it's pretty innovative. We used a line array microphone. It's a condenser. It's a series of condenser microphone elements built into a line array. So we're utilizing line array theory in a microphone. And I'll show an image of the ambo here in a minute. So this microphone, you can actually orient it a couple of different ways. You can put it vertically. If you do it vertically, then it's going to cover, it's going to get a very narrow, vertically narrow pickup area, but a very wide horizontal pickup area, which can be really nice if you put it in a group of like a barbershop quartet or something like that, people sort of around it. In this case, we oriented it horizontally because there could be someone who's 6'8", or there could be someone who's 4'8" walking up to this ambo speaking. And so that's a considerable difference in their height and where their mouth is. And so we laid it on its side, and therefore it has a very wide pickup area in the vertical plane, but it rejects, it's pretty narrow in the horizontal sense. So it's working well. And then pretty conventional wireless audio microphone setup for the clergy and the deacons, using a combination of head-worn mics so that they can use both their hands, and also clip-on mics. More on microphones. So for the choir, we used some suspended mics I mentioned earlier. Those are, we went with some, we didn't want to mess around. We went with some really good condenser supercardioid mics, actually, suspended from the ceiling. We had 2 of these. And I was going to just make a quick comment here on the 3-to-1 rule. So it's important when you have multiple microphones picking up the same source. How do you prevent comb filtering or destructive interference between those 2 microphones? And the solution is simple. You have to follow the 3-to-1 rule, which states that the distance of each microphone, if you have multiple microphones, they have to be 3 times the distance between the source and the mic. And the reason this works is because it achieves, it's around 9.5 decibels of difference between the signal level arriving at the 2 different microphones, which is enough to substantially eliminate phasing or comb filtering interference. So we did have to space those microphones apart farther than you would anticipate to properly pick up the choir area. And then the last little slide on microphones, don't want to really belabor it, but we did, of course, equip them with a wide assortment of mics for instrument, for vocals, whether it's stand mounted or handheld. Wanted to get them well set up. Even Catholic masses now are starting to employ a variety of acoustic and non-acoustic instrument music, which is nice. So the after photos, here's a view of the sanctuary now with the new loudspeaker system. You can see the 2 main cabinets up at the front on the ceiling, and then the first row of delay speakers on the ceiling as well. You can sort of see the stretched fabric absorptive ceiling system. If you don't even know what it is, then you probably wouldn't even realize that there's an acoustical treatment on the ceiling, which is frankly the goal of it. You can also, if you look on the walls, you can see the left and right column speakers. I love what they did with the lighting. By the way, I've in my career, I've also ventured into lighting design, and so I thought it was kind of neat how they replicated color changing LED strips inside of those Corbusier style niches in the walls, which they can change for different occasions throughout the year. They're probably purple right now, actually, leading up to Easter. Just another view from the back of the nave. Here's a view from the pretty close to the ambo or the pulpit, looking back towards the choir area. So you can really see the ceiling mounted delay speakers, and you can also sort of make out some of the column speakers on the walls. Here's another picture, almost the same photo, but getting a little bit closer to the choir area. So again, you can see these short, small format line array column speakers on the walls, spaced according to where we designed them. I think this photo was taken mid-construction, so you actually can't see the choir microphones just yet, but they're there. Here's a view just looking straight back into the back of the room. Again, you can see more of the small format line array speakers that were used to reinforce the choir. The baptismal font. This is what the ambo now looks like. It's a brand new ambo, really beautiful marble elements in there. And you can see the K array, line array, line array loudspeaker, multi-capsule microphone there. Laying on its side on a vibration isolator, so that if they set that really heavy Bible down onto the ambo, it doesn't make too much noise. Audio video people really enjoy looking at the gear behind the scenes, and so here's a snapshot of the audio video equipment rack. Network switch, wireless microphone system, moving from top to bottom. We have our QSC processor and a touch screen, so you can control the system, different modes of operation. Then we get down into the loudspeaker processing system, and then the amplifiers themselves. And then there's a couple of other amplifiers to drive the speakers in the cry room and the narthex. And then the last bit I wanted to touch on was the tuning and optimization. So this is like, I was telling my son the other day, it's not just about doing the thing you're supposed to do, but it's also about the follow through. I think he was unloading his laundry, and I was like, well, now you got to follow through and tell your sister that the washer is open and she can use it. That's the follow through. So the follow through for us on this was to go out and actually measure the system and make sure that it's going to, in fact, perform the way we wanted it to. It could have been anyone. It could have been any third-party engineer. In this case, they ended up wanting us to do it, which we were happy to do. So we measured it, both the main system and the choir system. We used a Rational Acoustics smart software app, and it does FFT measurements. We used pink noise generated from smart, and we used calibrated reference microphones to do our measurements. Here's some screenshots of the system as measured in the space. So on the top of these smart graphs, you'll see the phase plots. They aren't incredible at the lower frequencies, but above 1K, they get very even, and so that's a good thing. These phase plots are a little bit hard to wrap your head around when you first look at them. This is not too surprising, considering that we had so many different loudspeakers and locations within the same space generating noise. So it does make sense that there would be non-uniformity in terms of phase. However, for loudness and frequency response, we have extremely good coverage in the room. That's on the lower half of the graph. So this is the main system, and then here's the choir system. The red line represents the coherence, which is essentially how accurate the smart system is measuring everything. You'll notice there's a little bit of it's normal in a room like this for things to really go unpredictable below 60 hertz or so. We weren't too concerned with that because we used parametric EQ to do a high pass filter below 60 to 80 hertz, I want to say, maybe 50 to 60 hertz. So that's not a concern. However, you do see some non-uniformity, non-linearity up around 2 to 3K, and that's not awesome, but frankly, that's just a result of natural reflections in the space. While we did our best to help with the reverberation, they weren't up for adding even more absorption or diffusion, because it would have architecturally been detrimental. And so you just kind of got to do the best with what you can. But these results are actually pretty good. I didn't show screenshots of the initial measurements, but they were much, much, much worse. And then finally, we did some EQ adjustments to make the room less bright. It was extremely bright when we first went in and listened to it and attended some masses, added some warmth. We went with parametric EQ, no graphic EQ at all, and really minimized those EQ adjustments so that they're not too dramatic. And then in the D&B soundscape system, so we did a few minor adjustments on the levels of the speakers, but frankly, they were pretty good. We had to increase the levels of some of those delay speakers for the choir reinforcement so that you could frankly hear and properly localize the choir. But it's pretty cool because the loudspeakers the delay loudspeakers, they're almost as loud as the main loudspeakers that are left and right of the choir. But because of the delay for the time of arrival, when you're sitting in the audience, it doesn't sound like the audio is coming from this column speaker that may only be 10 feet away from you. It truly sounds like it's coming from the choir. And that's because the delay is around 5 to 6 milliseconds later, even for that one that's just sitting 8 to 10 feet away from you, for example. Pretty remarkable. And then finally, to wrap it up, so we adjusted the room acoustics, got the T60 reverb down to 1.5 seconds, replaced the sound system. We met all of their goals. The installed cost was around $227,000, not including a couple change orders, which is also normal. And that's it.
Patrick, I'm really fascinated by this stuff. First of all, we do have gear freaks around. So I know that they were interested in this. And of course, I've recorded many things in many churches. And I've always loved the acoustics of churches. But as long as we were inside the critical distance with our ORTF stereo pair, we were okay. But as far as intelligibility beyond the critical distance in the church, I didn't want anything to do with that. I find it interesting that you mentioned Le Corbusier, the architect, because he was associated with a famous 20th century composer named Xenakis. And Xenakis was a guest here at Carnegie Mellon, and we did a recording with him of pieces that he wrote for the Carnegie Mellon, pieces that he wrote, and the Carnegie Mellon Philharmonic recorded them.
Yes.
So I'm interested to know, when you have a speaker, and of course they design it to have a certain dispersion rate, right, to the left and right of the speaker cone or whatever, how accurate are those specifications? Because if you have speakers that leak out of their supposed coverage, wouldn't that interfere and ruin all of your equations?
It would. It's important to choose your speakers. First of all, you want them to be voiced similarly. So that was one consideration for us. We didn't want to go with a brand because, as you could sort of tell, we needed to use different form factors of speakers. Some were ceiling mounted, sort of like a horn, a high frequency horn, in order to project that sound a greater distance, with a larger low frequency element. And then for the side speakers, frankly, it wasn't going to be acceptable to go with a big, large diameter transducer and a horn. So we had to go with some, dome tweeters, for example, and try to more tightly control that. So that was part of the reason why we chose a manufacturer who not only offers the traditional point source cabinets, like the ones used on the ceilings, but also offers very small format column arrays, which is the ones we used on the walls. And the key is that the frequency response and the voicing is very consistent between the ceiling speakers and the wall speakers. As far as pattern control goes, it's it largely depends on the transducer size, right? So the low frequency is usually where the pattern control becomes a problem. Unfortunately, they didn't have the budget or the desire to reinforce this system down to significantly lower frequency range. So it doesn't perform that amazingly below 120 hertz or so. That is okay in this particular worship space for Catholic masses, mostly Catholic masses. There's not a lot of drums and bass. And they have keyboard and they have organ, but actually the organ uses its own set of speakers that are actually still sitting up in the choir area. So we didn't have to worry about the organ, thankfully. At one point, we were worried about the organ being reinforced in the same system, and so we insisted that we would need low frequency subwoofer speakers and additional reinforcement to control that. But once that was removed, then we were okay.
So was there any interference between the choir's normal acoustic sound and the sound that was amplified?
No, it truly sounds, it frankly sounds natural when you're sitting out in the congregation, even all the way up towards the front of the nave as you get near the chancel. It does not even sound amplified very significantly at all. It was difficult even for me and my colleagues. And I didn't even mention that this was a team of engineers who worked on all this, of course. But we could not even. It was very difficult for us to even perceive that sound was being emitted from some of those smaller column-array speakers.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
And how is intelligibility for speech?
It's incredible. The coherence and the linearity for the loudness and the time of arrival is, it's dialed in, and so we've got those microphones really well adjusted.
So it
That's
works.
the mic, and then the wireless mics, they sound terrific. Yeah.
And did your calculations for the delays, I guess, plural, in different areas, did the calculations come out to be right?
Yeah, I had to just claim that we sort of deferred that, right? It was sort of on the loudspeaker manufacturer to be responsible for those final calculations using their own software. We did an initial calculation using their software as we designed it, but then when it was contracted out to them, it was their responsibility to make the final delay adjustments. I looked at the delay settings. They're not significant. They're only like the first delays are, I think, maybe 2 to 3 milliseconds. Then the next set is maybe 5 to 7 milliseconds, something like that. So it's not substantial, but the outcome, it does sound quite good. And I invite you, if you're ever in Denver, to I'll take you to a mass or some event in this venue.
So did you check out just sitting in the space before and after to see what the difference would be?
Yeah, we did. We sent myself and our engineers to masses before and after, which is it's not usual. We don't usually go so far as to attend worship services, but it was it was kind of crucial, right? We needed to actually immerse ourselves into the audience to see what it's like.
Are there other questions or comments? Come on, dear freaks, wake up.
I have a question. With all those concave and convex surfaces, it appeared that your wall speakers were all the same height. I don't know if that's true, but it looked like it was. And are they the same design on each one? Or because you talked about tweeters, sound like they're different tweeters and different things on different, or are they all the same?
Yeah, so the point source ceiling mounted speakers, they have reentrant horns for their high frequency elements, and then the column speakers, they have neodymium dome tweeters. That's just the only difference there for the high frequency reinforcement. It's just you can't physically fit a reentrant horn into a very small column speaker. You're trying to keep that speaker as close to the wall as possible. as far as their heights go, actually, it's a good question, Mr. Blahakis, because ideally those column speakers would have been down even closer to the floor so that they would have been right around the average height of a listener's ear. Maybe
So were you
around.
aesthetically constrained to make them the same height?
We were worried that they would stick out more than 4 inches from the wall. There's a protrusion issue there for accessibility as part of the disability guidelines. You can't have something that protrudes greater than 4 inches from the wall if it's between 27 and 80 inches above the floor. And so we had to have those speakers up at 80 inches above the floor, exactly. And they are precisely, the bottom of them is at precisely 80 inches, which is as low as we could get them.
That was an amazing presentation. We built a new church in Williamsburg. I wish we had had the 270,000 or whatever to redo it, because you can't hear the priest half the time. Or some of them are sleeping for different reasons, but I think it wasn't the audio that was the problem there. But they try to do it back, but it makes a huge difference in a house of worship. That really is amazing.
Yeah, it does make a huge difference.
Congratulations.
Well, it was honestly just it was kind of an honor to get invited to participate and help out on this one.
All right, good.
Any other comments, questions? Come on.
Yeah, about the choir 3-to-1 rule about the choir miking. Yeah, I'm wondering if it actually applies to choir, because choir is not like one person, one single source, but like a sort of linear source made of like a lot of people. Like for like one specific person, it's like 1-to-3 ratio that is really perfect. But like for like any other person, like in the center, it will be like not 1-to-3 ratio.
That's correct. Yes, you're right. And so for when it is indeed a choir of 3 or more singers, I'll say, that is less important, especially because you have a natural blending of the voices. And so that destructive interference is it's just going to be part of the natural sound anyway. The 3-to-1 rule was more critical when there's only a single singer, which is actually very common in a Catholic mass setting. Sometimes, well, when they do their masses, they do them every single day. Morning, I think they do morning, noon, and sometimes a mid-morning or something like that. So for those weekly masses or weekday masses, they usually only have one singer, one piano player, and then one priest leading it. So you only have one source. Also, people do hold weddings and confirmations, other ceremonies in a Catholic church. And sometimes you'll have an instrumentalist, like a violin or an acoustic guitar. Of course, if it's acoustic guitar, we wouldn't be amplifying it using the choir mic. But if it's a violin, we would definitely be using those suspended choir mics, because the violinist is presumably standing. And that's a situation where we would want to make sure that we are following that 3-to-1 rule.
Well, yeah, this makes sense. And yeah, another small stuff is that like normally like in doing spatial audio, especially with a ton of speakers, like we have like several different approaches generally, like amplitude approaches like VBAP or DBAP, like generally say panning, and like phase approach like wavefield synthesis. Like as you have mentioned in this in DMB softwares, it's more like closer to the wavefield synthesis instead of panning. Is that correct?
You're saying, are they using wavefield synthesis instead of panning? Is that what I heard you ask?
Yeah, because you are mentioning a lot about like calculating different delays for different objects for the speakers, like that.
That's exactly correct. They do use wavefield synthesis. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. For wavefield synthesis, like as I know, because I'm also doing a project with like spatial audio and kind of stuff. Yeah, like for wavefield synthesis, we need to make all the speakers cover the hearing range so that it could actually apply. I don't think this is actually happening in the church, right?
What was the very last bit of that? Is what happening at the church?
Yeah, we are actually controlling the speaker filling range so that all the dispersion of speakers sort of diverge instead of like all the speakers are covering the same part of stuff. How does with precedence effect work if the audience is actually not hearing both of the speakers or all of the
Right.
speakers?
Yeah, that's true. So it's not doing active measuring and adjusting on the fly. There actually are systems that will do that. Of course, it was beyond a reasonable amount of complexity and also, cost limitation for this project to do something of that magnitude. So those sound objects, they're basically just fixed programmed into the software. So whichever input source or microphone input, if you will, is being played through the loudspeakers, it's assuming that it's at the location that was defined in the software.
Well, thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so for a priest, for example, they do walk around up at the front of the nave and over in the chancel area. So if they go all the way to the audience's left hand side and then they're continuing to talk, then it's not going to know that. The reinforcement of their voice will be localized, dead center, and so there's a slight divergence from that. Similarly, if let's say a violinist or someone from the choir area decides to venture away from the choir corner and kind of make their way, left or right, then there is the possibility of diverging a little bit from that. Of course, they probably wouldn't make it too far out before they would find themselves into the reinforcement coverage field itself, right? They'd be downstream or downstage of the speakers. And so most performers don't want to do that.
So Patrick, is this essentially a mono system?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we did not concern ourselves with panning. But that's an interesting question. I mean, if we had a different, basically a wider performance area or worship area at the front of the space, then I think we would have needed to consider varying the localization of objects, if you will, to their proper locations. And so one example would be that ambo microphone, the pulpit. It's over on the audience's right, or if you're a stage person, it would be stage left. It's not really being localized over to the audience's right currently. It's just, again, it's mixed so that it's localized dead center. I didn't observe any concern with that, just because the geometry of the space, when you're in it, it's so wide, and then it narrows to such a narrow stage at the front that I don't think anyone would be psychoacoustically confused by that sound object, the pulpit, basically coming from dead center. I think it.
So is there an engineer who's full-time for this setup? And do they pay the engineer?
There is a dedicated music director, but I believe that is a great question, whether he's paid or not. I don't think he is, Ricardo.
Well, I just know that the Catholics
Sure.
rely very much on volunteers.
They are.
Organists for the choir, and I just wondered about, this complicated system, who pulls the switch and turns it on and off, or does anything like that. And it seems that person would be quite important for this whole operation.
Crucial to the operation. Actually, it factored a lot into how we tried to design the system so that it would be as robust and kind of idiot-proof as possible. Because that music director, who I think is just a parishioner, he may move on. Actually, they changed music directors midway through the whole project, so it's inevitable that they'll move on. And so you need the system to be as dummy-proof as possible. That would be compared maybe to, for lack of a better term, like a mega church, or something where it's much more of a sort of a production and show. And they do often have a paid or semi-pro audio engineer who's running the sound.
Yeah, I know. I did a little bit of work in a mega church near Pittsburgh, outside of Pittsburgh, and that was a pretty good gig for the engineer.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
I was going to follow up on Ricardo's question. So with a system like this, is there someone like who you train on what the how the system operates and like how to debug something or like switch it off and on?
Yes. Yeah. So I didn't go over all the nuts, the details, but that is part of the scope of a project like this. Is we make sure that whoever installed the system walks through a minimum of 2 training sessions with the with all of the stakeholders from the parish or the owner's side. We attended one of those so that, if any questions came up from the original designers, which is us, they could ask those. And then all of that is not only recorded using a camera and delivered to them in a video archive format, but then they follow up with a written quick reference guide that they laminate. A couple of those. So
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
yeah, again, it's all about the follow through. You can sell, you can hire people to sell you equipment, but getting that handoff and having that degree of support is so important.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, Patrick, I can't thank you enough for being back in Vlahakis after all these years. And I'm glad to see also that you were on part of the recruiting team for the Career Center at Carnegie Mellon. So I hope some people showed up for your meeting when they had that a couple weeks ago.
I did. Thank you, Ricardo, for inviting me. It was a pleasure to be here. Thanks,
Sure.
everyone.
We'll
Hey,
see-
Patrick,
Yes.
it's Tom Sullivan. How you doing?
Hey, Tom.
Hey,
Good.
so you worked for Greg Visa initially, right? When you left? Do you know what Greg's
Yeah.
doing now?
Oh, it's been maybe 3 or 4 years since I talked to him, but the last I talked to him, he was still designing recording studios.
Okay, I wasn't sure if he retired or not at this point, but
I don't know. I should reach out to him.
he's been around Pittsburgh for a long time. So
That's right. I think he's in the South Hills, if I remember right.
yeah, I'm not sure where he lives now, but
I'm going to reach out to him though.
Okay, Patrick, well, we'll get together again soon, okay? Just the 2 of us.
Sounds good, Ricardo. Bye, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
thank
Okay.
you.